My life didn't change when I bought this land, and it didn't change when I buried the dearest person I had beneath the pines on the hill. It changed the day I took him from there, from a place people don't enter without a reason, and a place, if I'm honest, it's better not to come back from with empty hands. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't planning to save anything. I was just walking the woods the way I'd walked them my whole life, thinking about work and weather, wondering whether the old fence would make it through one more winter. And then I saw a little one who had no business being there, and I did what any decent person does when they see a child freezing. Only this wasn't a human child. My name is Ben Miller. I was 59, and I was the kind of farmer the town calls stubborn and the land calls necessary. I lived on the edge of the forest, where morning fog lies across the fields like an old quilt, and where the smell of stove smoke clings to your clothes longer than any conversation. After losing someone close, the house got quieter and the days got flatter, as if someone had taken the music out of life and left only sounds: the tractor, rain on the roof, the dog dozing under the porch. I never had the habit of making things up. If something was there, I could fix it. If something wasn't, then it wasn't worth thinking about. That day, the woods smelled of wet bark, and last year's leaves turned to mush under my boot like damp potato peelings. A short rain had passed not long before, one of those rains that doesn't wash anything clean. It just makes everything shine. Needles on the firs, stones in the creek, old ruts in the dirt road. I was headed out to check the far fence line, because in the night it sounded like something heavy had been shoving the boards near the north corner. I had my own guesses: deer, bear, maybe a cow had pushed through. I took a hammer, some wire, and a small flashlight, even though it was still light out. Habit. At my age, a flashlight is like a seatbelt, not always needed, but always smart to have. At first, everything was normal. Birds called to each other high up, invisible among the treetops. Somewhere to the left, a woodpecker knocked steadily, like someone testing boards for soundness. And the creek sang the way only water on stone can sing, without hurry but stubborn. I walked the familiar trail and thought about small things: whether the feed would last to the end of the month, whether I needed to replace the belt on the generator. Then the woods became different. Not scary, not spooky, just different. The way it feels when you step into a room and realize someone was there a moment ago, even though you didn't see him. The birds seemed to hush, the wind softened, and my footsteps suddenly sounded too loud. I stopped and listened. The sound of my own breathing felt strangely clear. I caught a smell, not animal the way a barn is animal, and not wild like a predator. Something warm and wet, like old fur after rain, mixed with soil. I moved slower, choosing places where less would crunch. After a few dozen steps, the trail seemed to vanish. Not overgrown, it just stopped being human. The ground was tamped down, but not by boots. Branches were pushed aside as if moved by hands that don't wear gloves. Stones weren't scattered at random. A few flat ones formed a straight line, like someone had marked a boundary. I didn't know the word village then. I only thought, somebody lives here, and whoever it is doesn't want to be bothered. I should have turned back. Plain sense said, Ben, the woods hold all kinds of things. If it isn't yours, don't touch it. But I wasn't there out of curiosity. I was there because after losing someone, one simple thing still held me together: responsibility. You see a problem, you deal with it. And then I heard a sound, short, thin, nothing like a rabbit's squeal or nothing like a bird's cry. It was more like a crushed breath someone was trying to hide. I froze. Then, without knowing why, I crouched and pushed a fern aside. He was laying there, in a hollow between roots, as if the earth itself had made him a small bed. A little one, hairy, but the hair wasn't wild like an animal's. It was matted in clumps like a dog after a bath. His hands, not paws, were pressed to his chest. His eyes were big and dark, and there was no anger in them, only fear, clean as cold water. He looked at me the way children look when they don't know whether you're going to hit him or lift him up. His chest rose in quick, uneven breaths. I saw he was shaken, not from rage, from cold or weakness. Nearby on the ground were tracks, many of them, large ones, different sizes, like several beings had gathered here. And a little further on I saw a shelter made of branches, built so neatly it made me feel ashamed of my crooked wood piles by the shed. I didn't think long. There wasn't time to think. I took off my jacket, laid it over him carefully, and slid my hands under his back and knees. He jerked in fear, but he didn't bite or strike. He simply held his breath like he was afraid to move at all. He was heavier than he looked, and warmer, like there was still a spark inside that refused to go out. I rose slowly so I wouldn't frighten him more than necessary, and I felt the hair lift on the back of my neck, not from superstition, but from a simple understanding. I was doing something after which nothing would ever be the same. The walk back felt longer. The woods didn't shove me or block me, but it felt as if it was watching. I didn't see anyone between the trees, but I sensed presence as clear as you sense rain before it falls. Something in the air shifts, and your skin knows it. The little one in my arms made a soft sound now and then. Not a cry, not a sob, but something that might have been a question. I didn't answer with words. I only pulled my jacket tighter around his shoulders and kept walking. By the time I reached the farm, the sun was already dropping. The light had turned yellow, and dust in the air showed like thin smoke. The dog lifted its head, sniffed, and stepped back a pace. No barking, just alert. That told me more than any book could. I carried the little one into the old storeroom beside the barn, where I used to keep grain sacks. It was dry in there, and it smelled of wood and old straw. I spread a blanket, set down a bowl of water, laid out a couple apples and a piece of cornbread left from morning. He didn't lunge at the food. He only watched, memorized, listened. And when I stepped back, he loosened his fingers slightly, as if allowing himself to breathe. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold and listened to every creak in the house. After my loss, the house had been full of silence already, but that night the silence was different, not empty, but tense. I went to the window more than once, looking out at the dark yard and the line of trees standing like a wall. The stove crackled, but the sound didn't soothe me. It only reminded me there was another warmth in my home now, and I had to keep it alive. In the morning, I went into the storeroom and saw an apple had been gnawed. The water level was lower. The little one sat closer to the door, as if he wanted to be near the exit, but didn't dare. I crouched slowly, not looking straight into his eyes. That's what you do with frightened animals, and I didn't know then which of us that rule fit best. I set another apple on the floor and a little honey on a piece of bread. He inhaled, as if the smell of honey was more than food to him, as if it was a sign. He took it, but not greedily. He took it carefully, with 2 fingers, and there was so much caution in that gesture that something tightened in my chest. Then, closer to noon, I heard something heavy, not thunder, not a tractor, not wind. The ground began to answer under footsteps, one, then another. I stepped out into the yard, wiped my hands on my pants and froze. At the edge of the woods, where the shade was thicker, they stood. Not one, not 2. I counted at least 5 large figures, tall, broad, shaggy, yet not wild in how they carried themselves. They stood the way people stand when they've come not to fight, but to take back what's theirs, if they must, though they'd rather not. My mouth went dry, not from panic, from the understanding that every movement I made now had weight. I didn't go inside for the rifle. I didn't even turn my head that way. I simply raised my hands a little so they could see, empty, and I stepped forward, slowly, placing my boots as if the ground might take offense. In that moment, a sound came from the storeroom, thin and ragged. The little one. He was so frightened it carried through the boards. I heard him dart inside, something light thump against the wall, nails or whatever he had scrape the wood. That wasn't fear of me, that was fear of them, and it turned my stomach, not because of legends, but because of a plain thought. If he was afraid of his own, then there had been a reason he'd ended up alone. One of the big ones stepped closer. His movement was slow, like someone trying not to scare you. He lifted his hand, and it was a hand with fingers and a palm, not a paw. He touched his chest, then pointed towards the woods, then towards my storeroom. The gesture was so clear I didn't need words. Us. Home. Little one. I swallowed and nodded once, short, not a yes, but I hear you.
Another, a bit shorter, made a different gesture. His palms came together and then separated, showing the space between us, as if he'd stretched an invisible string, an agreement. Not friendship, not goodness, an agreement. Then he pointed at me, straight, without anger, and lowered his hand toward the ground. Responsibility. The word wasn't spoken, but I felt it the way you feel cold metal, immediate, down to the bone. I stepped back toward the storeroom, and without turning my back on them fully, opened the door. The little one sat in the far corner, curled tight like a knot. His eyes shone. His breathing was fast. He trembled, and in that trembling was everything: guilt, fear, exhaustion, the wish to vanish. I didn't drag him out. I simply crouched and put my palm on the floor between us, a sign that I wasn't crawling closer, that I wasn't hunting. He looked at me, then at the doorway, then toward where the big ones stood, and they didn't come in. Not one crossed the threshold. That struck me more than their size, because if they'd been beasts, they would have taken him. If they'd been monsters from campfire talk, they would have splintered boards and torn the yard apart. But they stayed at the boundary, like people who respect another's home, even if that home isn't theirs. The leader pointed again at the little one, then at me, then made a motion like closing a door. Then he gestured toward the forest, his fingers spreading like branches. There are many, there is life, but he is here. The little one made a small sound, and I thought it held not pleading, but surrender, the kind only children have when they realize the adults have already decided. I nodded a second time, slower. Then the oldest made one final gesture, palm to chest, then palm extended, not toward me, but into the space between us. Not a hand offered to shake, but a word given. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I knew. I put my own palm to my chest and nodded. Not like a hero, like a farmer who had just signed a contract without reading the fine print, because there wasn't time. They stood a few seconds more. The woods around us seemed to hold its breath. Then, one by one, they turned and walked away, quiet despite their weight. I watched their backs between the trees like dark moving pillars. The little one didn't relax right away. He stayed curled in his corner for a long time, as if expecting them to return and change their minds. And I stood at the storeroom door, feeling my hands grow heavy. Not with fear, but with responsibility you can't shrug off like a wet coat. That evening, I drove to the store for salt and feed. I needed to step into normal life for even 10 minutes just to convince myself the world hadn't flipped upside down. By the gas pump stood a foreign pickup with plates from outside our county. On the rear window was a sticker with a university logo or something like it. I didn't look hard. Two men were talking with a local, and in their hands weren't bags of bread, but maps and folders. As I walked past, one of them glanced at my boots, the way people look when they know how to read tracks as well as I know how to read weather. I got into my old pickup, put my hands on the steering wheel, and didn't start the engine for a few seconds. Somewhere back at the farm, Moss sat in the dim and listened to my house the way I listened to the woods. Somewhere beyond the tree line was the village that had left me a child, not out of mercy, but out of an agreement. And now another line existed in the world, not a fence, not a property boundary, but the line between what people call a campfire tale and what they might come for with folders, cameras, and cold eyes. I started the engine. The old motor rattled in a familiar way, as if to say, "Keep working, Ben. Work doesn't do itself." But I already knew my work had changed, and those changes hadn't asked whether I was ready. I learned pretty quick that the hardest part wasn't hiding Moss from the world. It was keeping my life from looking like a lie. A farm runs on habits. You buy feed on the same day. You fix what breaks before it breaks worse. You wave at the same folks at the same stop sign. People don't notice what you do once.
They noticed what you stopped doing. After the village came to my tree line and left him with me, after that quiet bargain made out of gestures and steady eyes, I started changing things without meaning to. I stopped lingering at the diner. I stopped letting anyone just swing by. I stopped talking long at the counter of the hardware store. Not because I was trying to be mysterious, because every extra word felt like it might carry something I couldn't afford to spill. At first, Moss stayed in the grain room like it was the only safe place on earth. He'd sit in the far corner, knees pulled up, arms wrapped around them, his back pressed to the boards. If I moved too fast, his shoulders tightened. If the dog barked outside, his head snapped toward the sound, eyes wide, tracking it the way deer do. He was small compared to what I'd seen in the timber, but he wasn't small like a human child. His bones were heavier, his hands were bigger, and still the way he folded into himself, ready to vanish, was all kid. I didn't name him right away. I told myself it was respect. The truth was, naming him would have made him real in a way I wasn't ready for. A name isn't just a label, it's a doorway. But one morning, after he'd started eating regular, apples in careful bites, cornbread in small pieces, honey like it was medicine, I opened the grain room door and found him standing in a thin shaft of light that slid through a crack in the boards. The sun caught his hair, damp and dark, and it carried that greenish cast you see on shaded stones and wet bark, the color of the forest when it's thinking. "Moss," I said, quiet as a thought. He didn't answer. There was never an answering. But he turned his head toward me, not startled, just alert. I tapped my chest. "Ben." Then I pointed toward him. "Moss." He stared at my hand, then at my face, then down at his own chest, like he was checking for a place the sound might stick. After a long moment, he made a soft, breathy noise. Not a word, nothing close, but something between acceptance and memory. It was the closest thing to agreement I'd ever heard from him. After that, the days began to find their shape, and the shape looked more ordinary than anyone would believe. I fixed the grain room so it stayed warm without feeling sealed. I didn't lock him in,
The latch held against wind, but if he pushed hard enough, it would give. I hung an old wool blanket over the little window instead of boarding it up. I left water in a heavy bucket that wouldn't tip easy, and I made a habit of approaching the door the same way every time. 2 slow steps, a pause, a soft knock, so he could learn my rhythm and stop bracing for surprises. Then the work started, because work always starts on a farm, and Moss, whether he meant to or not, began stepping into it with me. The first time he helped me chop wood, I didn't ask. I was out by the block early, breath steaming, splitting fir rounds for the stove. He stood a few yards away, under the barn's shadow, watching my arms, the swing, the crack when the wedge found grain. I split a piece clean and set it aside. He stepped forward and picked up one half in both hands, turned it once like he was weighing the idea of it, and carried it to the stack. Not clumsy, not showy, just done. I froze with the maul in my hands, not because I thought he'd hurt himself, because it hit me how normal that looked, how natural it was to have someone else move wood while I kept chopping, like an old father and a quiet son who didn't talk much but understood the day needed doing. After that, he did it again the next morning, and the next. He learned the rhythm of my chores faster than any hired hand I'd ever had. He'd haul water from the pump in 2 buckets at once, one in each hand, walking steady like the weight didn't matter. He'd carry feed sacks that should have bent a man in half and set them down as gently as if they were eggs. When I brought in hay, he'd stand at the barn door and catch bales I tossed, stacking them with a neatness that made me feel messy. Sometimes he'd pause to sniff a bale, face pressed to the dry grass, like he was reading it. We saw each other every day, not in the way people imagined friendship, no talking, no sitting shoulder to shoulder by a fire telling secrets, more like 2 beings sharing a small territory and learning each other's boundaries without needing to argue about them. He understood wait pretty quick. I'd hold up my hand, palm out, and he'd stop. He understood no, too, though he didn't like it. If he wandered too close to the road edge, I'd shake my head and tap the barn post twice, the signal, and he'd back up, head angled, eyes narrowed, like he was filing the rule away. I learned his signals, too. A quick point toward the timber meant he heard something. A flat hand on the ground meant stay low. A small, impatient huff through his nose meant I was taking too long with something that mattered to him. He was curious in quiet ways. He liked coffee, but never drank it. He'd sit near the kitchen door in winter when warm air leaked out under the frame, his eyes half closed, breathing slow. He liked apples more than meat, and honey was a kind of holiday. If I set a jar lid with honey out, he'd touch it with one finger first, then lick that finger, like he didn't trust good things to last. And every so often, he'd do something that reminded me he wasn't raised in my world. He'd hear a sound I didn't hear. He'd stop in the middle of chewing, like someone turned a dial down on his body. His fingers froze around an apple slice, his shoulders tightened, and his eyes tracked upward, through branches toward gaps in the canopy. Once I followed his gaze and saw a faint glint between fir boughs, glass catching sun. It could have been water, it could have been trash, but it stayed in the same place too long, and when I took 3 steps toward it, it vanished too fast. After that, I started paying attention to my property the way I paid attention to weather. I noticed trier tracks where trier tracks didn't belong, shallow at first, then deeper, like someone had come in after a rain.
I noticed a cigarette smell on a morning when no one I knew had been close enough to smoke on my land. I noticed boot prints on a game trail, soles too clean, stride too stiff, like a man walking with purpose instead of moving with the ground. In town, the talk shifted too. At the feed store, a man I'd known since we were both young enough to think we'd live forever leaned on a stack of grain and said, casual as anything, "You hear they got folks up by the ridge with cameras? Some university outfit? Looking for that, you know." He didn't say the word. He didn't need to. Everybody had a word for it, and most of them were said with a laugh that was meant to keep the fear out. I shrugged, like it didn't matter. That's what you do when you're holding something fragile behind your ribs. But driving home, I kept my eyes on the tree line and my hands tighter on the steering wheel than they needed to be. That winter was when my life truly split in two. On the surface, I was still Ben Miller, the farmer who fixed his own fence and plowed his own driveway and didn't bother people. Underneath, I was living by a second calendar made of shadows and quiet decisions. I moved my feeding spot farther from the house, still on my property, but nearer the creek where running water could swallow small noises. Moss would go with me sometimes, stopping short of the open line where he could be seen, watching the woods while I set food down. He wasn't begging, he was guarding the moment. Sometimes he left small signs back, not gifts like people imagine, no shiny treasures, no dramatic offerings, small practical things. A smooth river stone placed where the honey had been, a snapped twig laid across the path that led toward the north ridge, like a quiet warning, not today. Once, after I found fresh boot prints near my creek line, I came back the next day, and those prints were gone, erased in a way that didn't look like rain. It looked like careful work. Over the next years, I saw the others only a handful of times, never close, never long. A tall shape at dusk on the far fence line, motionless like a trunk. Two together once, moving through timber like they owned the air between trees. A female figure one evening, narrower shoulders, a heavier calm in the way she stood, with a little one pressed against her side. They never stepped into my yard. They never tested my doors. They stayed just far enough away to remind me the bargain was still alive. And Moss watched them the way a kid watches the edge of a room where adults are talking about his future. He didn't run to them. He didn't call out. He just held still, breathing shallow, as if any motion might change the outcome. But the outside world didn't stay old-fashioned. It started bringing new eyes into the forest. The first trail camera I found was strapped to a fir not far from the creek, a black plastic box with a lens like an unblinking pupil. It faced a game trail Moss sometimes crossed when he moved between my place and the deeper woods. I stared at it a long time, my breath fogging in the cold, thinking about choices. I could smash it, I could steal it. Both would leave evidence I didn't want. So I did the quietest thing I could think of. I tilted it up so it faced the sky and walked away. If someone checked the card, they'd get clouds and birds and nothing else. No proof, no scandal, just wasted effort. A month later, there were two. Then came the drone. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a distant chainsaw, faint, steady, floating above the treetops. Moss heard it before I did. He was out by the woodpile in daylight, close to the barn like always, and he froze mid-step. His shoulders rose, his head tipped back, and his eyes locked onto something moving through a break in the branches. I followed his gaze and saw it, a small, dark shape hovering, shifting position in little jerks like an insect. It held there long enough to make my skin tighten, then drifted off toward the ridge. Moss backed under the shed overhang fast enough he barely made a sound. He pressed into shadow like he'd been built for it. That night he barely ate. He sat in the grain room with his knees drawn up again, like the years had slid away and he was back to the first week, cold, watchful, waiting. I sat outside the door with my back to the wall and a mug of coffee that went cold in my hands. The house creaked the way old houses do. Wind moved through the eaves.
Somewhere far off, an owl called once, and I understood, with a kind of plain sadness, that my old plan, silence and routine, wasn't going to be enough forever. By fall, the pressure felt constant, like humidity before a storm. I noticed more vehicles on forest roads. I noticed strangers at trailheads with long lens cameras. I noticed the way people stared at the tree line like they expected it to blink. Moss's behavior changed too. He paused more often during his short daylight outings. He stared into the timber with that tight, listening stillness. Twice he made a low, breathy sound I'd never heard before, something between warning and question. And sometimes he pointed upward toward nothing I could see, then down toward the creek line, like he was trying to map danger in 3 dimensions. I kept telling myself it would pass, that these folks would get bored, that the forest would swallow their interest like it swallows footsteps. Then came the day I let my attention slip for 5 minutes.
It was early afternoon, crisp and clean, the first hint of cold in the air. Leaves were turning at the edges. I had fence work to do near the far pasture. One of the posts had loosened after a storm and the wire was sagging. It wasn't far from the barn, but it was far enough that I couldn't watch Moss every second. I let him out anyway because routine is a kind of medicine, and I didn't want to turn his world into a prison again. He moved along the barn's shadow, hands brushing boards like he was reading them. He crouched by the creek and splashed water over his forearms. He picked up a handful of grass and smelled it. Then he stood very still and looked toward the north ridge. I should have called him back right then. We had small signals by then, a tap on the shed wall, the rattle of the apple bucket that meant come in. But the fence wire in my hands snapped sharp, and my mind went to the practical problem the way it always did. I bent down, working the wire tight again, hammering staples into the post. When I straightened up, the yard felt wrong, too open, too quiet. "Moss," I said, and the name came out sharper than I meant it to. No answer, only hens clucking and the creek's steady voice. The dog was on its feet under the porch, ears forward, tail low, staring toward the trees. My stomach tightened, not panic, just the heavy certainty that something had gone where it shouldn't. I moved toward the timberline without running. Running makes noise. Noise invites attention. I followed soft depressions in the grass where his weight had passed. They angled north, not toward his usual safe loop, but toward the ridge. Halfway into the trees, the smell changed. Pine and damp soil, yes, but underneath it, something sharp and wrong. Gasoline. Then I heard voices, human voices, not far. I slowed until my steps were more thought than movement. I pushed aside ferns with the back of my hand. I kept my breathing shallow because breath is loud when everything else is quiet. And then I saw it. A small clearing up on the ridge, 2 tents, a folding table, hard cases stacked like toolboxes, a tripod, a man in a cap holding a camera with a long lens, another man leaning over a device with wires running to a battery pack, a low generator hum under everything. Researchers, people looking for proof. I scanned the brush around their camp, desperate to spot moss before they did. Nothing at ground level, no crouched shape behind logs. Then I looked up. High in a fir near the clearing, moss clung to the trunk, pressed flat against bark and shadow. He'd climbed higher than I would have guessed he could. His body was still, so still he might have been a dark patch of bark if you weren't looking for the curve of his shoulder, the tilt of his head. One of the men laughed and turned, lifting his lens toward the trees, toward that fir. Time stretched.
One wrong second could break everything. I didn't shout. I didn't throw a rock. I didn't do anything that would point them to him. Instead, I stepped back and snapped a dead branch under my boot, hard, deliberate, far enough away that it sounded like a deer in brush. Every head turned. The man with the lens swung it toward the sound, toward me, not toward the tree. I moved deeper, making just enough noise to keep their attention, but not enough to sound like a man. Another branch cracked, leaves rustled. I let out a low grunt, half effort, half animal, something easy to dismiss. "Got something," one of them said, clear as day. They stepped away from the table. One man lifted a handheld device and swept it side to side like he was painting the woods with invisible light. I kept moving, angling away, dragging their focus toward thicker brush where a person would have to fight through and lose patience. When their voices were far enough behind me, I circled back, silent now, careful, watching the fur. It was empty. Not empty because he'd fallen, empty because he'd moved the way something born to the forest moves. No drama, no sound, just gone. I found him half a mile away behind a fallen log, crouched in a hollow, breathing hard through his nose. His eyes were wide, but there was something else in them now besides fear. Understanding. He'd learned how close people could get, and I'd learned how thin my control really was. I held out an apple, open palm. He took it, but he didn't eat. He just stared at me, then lifted his hand and pointed upward toward the sky, the drone, the lens, the new eyes. I nodded once, not because I had a plan, because I understood the message. We went home under trees and shadow. When we reached the yard, Moss slipped into the grain room without being told. He sat with his back against the wall, shoulders rounded forward, the apple still in his hand like a thing he'd forgotten how to use. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my hands around a mug I didn't drink from. The house was quiet in the old way, creaks, wind, distant water, but underneath it was a new kind of quiet. The quiet of something being watched, the quiet of a man realizing his fences were made of twigs. Moss broke our rules on a Tuesday, and I remember that only because Tuesday was the day I drove into town for feed and diesel. He was supposed to be in the grain room by then, tucked back in that dim, safe corner of my life where no one could stumble over him by accident. He was supposed to stay quiet when the world got noisy. That had been our whole system, distance, routine, and the kind of caution that looks like patience from the outside. But that morning, I found him waiting for me in the open. Not out by the barn where the shadows did most of the hiding, not near the creek where sound covered small mistakes. He was in the yard, in plain view from the back side of the house, standing still as a fence post. The fog hadn't burned off yet, and the grass was wet enough to darken my boots. I had my keys in my hand, the truck door half open, and for a second I just stood there, feeling the shape of that wrongness settle over everything. His eyes weren't wide with fear like they'd been on the ridge near the researchers' camp. They were focused, urgent, like he'd been holding a message in his chest all night and couldn't hold it anymore. He lifted one hand and pointed, past my pasture, past the tree line, toward the north ridge. Then he pointed up, not in a vague way, not a child's gesture. He traced a slow, deliberate line through the air the way a man points out a hawk he's actually seen. Then his fingers closed into a fist and opened again, twice, like something blinking, like something hovering. The drone. My throat went dry. I didn't have to ask. I didn't have to pretend. I just nodded once, slow, so he could see it. He stepped closer than he ever had in daylight, close enough that I could smell him clearly, wet earth, old wood, and that faint animal warmth that wasn't dirty so much as honest. He pressed his palm flat to his chest, then reached out and touched the air between us like he was touching a rope. Us. Then he pointed toward the woods again, and this time his hand didn't stop at trees. It swept wider, like he was talking about more than one, a whole space, a whole life. And then he made the gesture that finally made my stomach drop. He cradled his arms as if holding a baby, rocked them once, and looked straight at me. There were young ones out there, vulnerable ones, and whatever was coming wasn't only coming for him. I'd told myself 100 times that Moss was the exception, a lost child, a strange mercy the forest had demanded from me. But that gesture, simple, human in its meaning, reminded me what I'd been refusing to admit. He wasn't alone, not truly, and he wasn't just hiding for his own sake. I shut the truck door without getting in. That was my first decision. The second came when I went inside, set my keys on the hook like it was an ordinary day, and pulled my old topo map from the drawer where it had lived since before everything started changing. I spread it on the kitchen table and stared at the lines like they were going to tell me the future. Moss stood in the doorway, watching, not impatient, not calm either, waiting.
I took a pencil and circled the ridge where I'd seen the research camp. I circled the trailhead where strangers parked. I marked the creek line. I marked my fence. Then I tapped the map and looked at him. "You can't keep walking the way you used to," I said, knowing the words were for me as much as for him. He didn't understand the sentence, but he understood the weight behind it. He stepped forward and laid 2 fingers on the map, right where the ridge sat. Then he dragged those fingers down toward my property line and stopped. Close. Then he dragged them farther, past my land, deeper into the timber, and stopped again. Far. His head tilted, and he made a short, breathy sound that felt like a question. Which way? That was when I realized what he was doing. He wasn't just warning me. He was asking for help making a choice. I'd helped him carry water. I'd helped him stack wood. I'd taught him small rules. Stop here. Don't go there. Stay low when the road is loud. But those were child rules, survival rules for a smaller world. Now the world had grown teeth and eyes and little machines that floated above the canopy. He needed different knowledge, the kind I never wanted to pass on, because passing it on meant admitting we were in this for real. So I started teaching him, not in lessons, not in speeches, in the only way I knew, by doing the work and letting him watch. I showed him the difference between human tracks and animal tracks. A deer leaves a clean heart shape. A man leaves a tread pattern and a straight stride, like he believes the ground owes him a path. I'd crouch by the creek mud and press my finger into the print to show depth, direction. Moss would crouch beside me and study it, then look up at my face like he was listening for something I wasn't saying. I showed him wire. One afternoon, I took a coil of fence wire and stretched it low between 2 posts, tight enough to catch a boot. I walked into it on purpose and let it snag my shin. I didn't make a big show, but I let my body react the way it would. Pain, surprise, stumble. Moss flinched hard, then stepped closer, eyes narrowed, and reached toward the wire without touching it. He moved his fingers near it the way you move your hand near a hot stove to feel the heat. I shook my head sharply, no. Then I took a stick and lifted the wire, showing him how it could catch, how it could pull, how it could hold. He stared at it for a long time, then backed away and touched the tree beside him with his palm, grounding himself. I showed him sound. I started pointing out the difference between the honest noises of the woods and the ones that came from people. A chainsaw has a bite to it, a steady hunger.
A generator hums like a fat insect that never gets tired. A drone, when it's close enough, sounds like a distant swarm, a vibration more than a note. Sometimes when the air was still, I'd stop mid-chore and tilt my head as if listening. Moss would mirror me instantly, and then his eyes would go up, scanning places my eyes wouldn't have thought to scan. He was already better at this than I was. He just needed context, names, meaning, prediction. I even taught him about light. I took my flashlight out at night and shined it across the yard, then turned it off and watched how the darkness returned. I showed him how light reflects off eyes, off wet leaves, off glass. I showed him how a person with a spotlight thinks they own whatever they can see. Moss watched all of it with that quiet intensity that made me feel like I was teaching someone who would remember long after I was gone. And then I did the hardest thing. I taught him restraint, because his strength wasn't the problem. His strength was what would get him killed if he used it wrong. I pointed at my own chest and shook my head. No fight. I held up my hands, palms out, slow. I mimed someone raising a gun with my finger, and then I dropped to one knee the way a man drops when he's hit. Moss's face changed at that. Not anger, something colder, something that lived deeper. He made a low sound in his throat, and for a second I worried I'd opened a door I couldn't close. So I put my hand on the ground between us, stay, and breathed out slow. I waited. After a long moment, he nodded once, small, tight.
Like a promise he didn't like making. The pressure from the outside kept building while we did all this, like the world didn't care that we were trying to catch up. More trucks on the forest roads, more strangers at the trailhead. A man in town wearing a vest with some agency name on it, asking questions too polite to be harmless. I heard the phrase survey work and environmental assessment, and those words sounded clean, but I'd lived long enough to know clean words can still mean bulldozers. The worst day came when I didn't even leave my property. It was late afternoon. The light had that slant to it that makes everything look old. Moss was helping me split wood, me swinging the maul, him stacking the halves with quiet efficiency. We'd fallen into a rhythm that almost made me forget the ridge, the drone, the camp. Then Moss stopped. Not gradually, like a switch had flipped. His head lifted, his shoulders went tight, his eyes went up and then toward the north ridge. He made that breathy warning sound, short, sharp, and pointed. I listened. At first I heard nothing but wind. Then, faintly, the low thrum of an engine. Not on the highway, closer, on a forest road. Then another engine, and another. Convoy. Moss's fingers dug into the wood he was holding, and the wood cracked under his grip like dry bread. He didn't mean to do it. It just happened. Fear does that. It turns strength into accident. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not just fear of being found, fear of running out of places to run. I set the maul down slowly, handle first so it wouldn't thud. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped closer. "It's changing," I said, soft. "I know." He stared at my face like he could pull more meaning out of it than my words carried. Then he turned and took 2 steps toward the timberline, like he was gonna leave right then, like he was gonna go warn the others, like he was gonna disappear into the only world that still felt honest. I couldn't let that be the only move we had. "Moss," I said, firm, not loud. He stopped. I pointed toward the house, then toward the ridge, then drew a line in the air between those places and sliced it with my hand. No, not like before, not the old pattern, not hiding and hoping. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I walked to the edge of the yard, to the place where the tree line began, and I stood there in the open.
I didn't gesture wildly. I didn't plead. I simply stood, hands visible, shoulders relaxed, the way you stand when you're waiting for someone to decide if you're worth trusting. Moss watched me. His breathing was fast. His posture was torn between flight and something else. Then, slowly, he stepped to my side, not touching me, not leaning on me, just beside me, like an ally. We stood there together, farm man and forest child, watching the timber as if it might speak. And in that moment, I understood the truth I'd been dodging. I was getting old. My legs weren't as quick. My hands weren't as steady. My control over my small patch of world was fading. If this secret was going to survive, it couldn't survive on hiding alone. It needed terms, boundaries, a plan that wasn't just fear. Moss glanced at me, then pointed toward the house, my world, then toward the woods, his world, and then he pressed his palm to his chest again. Me. And for the first time, I didn't read that gesture as help me. I read it as I'm choosing. He was choosing to stop living like a shadow. Not to become human, not to walk into town and shake hands, but to stop being hunted without being seen, to stop losing ground without ever standing his. The engines on the forest road grew louder, then faded as the convoy turned somewhere out of earshot, but the sound left a mark on the air, like thunder that's already passed, but still makes your bones feel hollow. That night, Moss didn't go straight to the grain room. He followed me to the back porch and stood in the dark with me, both of us facing the tree line. The stars were out, sharp and cold. Somewhere far off, a branch snapped. Maybe deer, maybe something bigger, maybe nothing at all. I didn't speak for a long time. Words felt too small. Finally, I said, if they come here with papers and cameras, if they start walking through my woods like they own 'em, hiding won't be enough. Moss turned his head slightly, listening to my voice the way he listened to the wind. Then he lifted one hand and made a slow, deliberate motion, like opening a door. He looked at me, and his eyes held no panic now, only resolve. That was the moment the old pattern broke for good. Because once a door is opened, even just in the mind, you can't go back to pretending the room doesn't exist. And I knew with the same plain certainty I used when I watched storm clouds stack over the ridge that a meeting was coming. Not a near miss in the trees, not a shadow on a camera, a real contact on ground we would have to choose, on terms we would have to fight for. Whether I was ready or not, whether Moss was ready or not, the world was walking toward us, and for the first time, Moss wasn't stepping back. The first real meeting didn't happen in a clearing with television lights or a crowd holding up phones. It happened the only way it could have happened, without getting someone killed. Quiet, controlled, and small enough to fit inside one man's conscience. I chose the place, a shallow bend in the creek where the water ran clear over stone and the banks rose on both sides like low walls. There was one way in by foot, one way out, and enough trees around it to swallow sound. It was close enough to my land that I could get there before dawn and be back before anyone noticed I'd been gone. I chose the people, too. Not the kind who chase headlines, not the kind who talk about assets and specimens. I picked two, and that was it. Sheriff Callahan, who had known my father and still took his hat off in church, and Dr. Lila Monroe from the little clinic in town. Calm hands, tired eyes, a woman who had seen more fear than gossip.
They didn't believe me when I asked them to come. Not at first. They tried to laugh it off, the way folks do when the truth is too strange to set down on the table. But I didn't argue. I just said, come without a weapon. Come without a camera. If you can't do that, Don't come at all. And something in my voice must have made them understand this wasn't a story. We met before sunrise. The air smelled like wet rock and pine sap. The creek talked to itself in the dark. Callahan kept his hands in his pockets like he was trying not to reach for something that wasn't there. Dr. Monroe stood still, breathing slow, watching the tree line the way you watch a dog that might bolt. I had told Moss the rules in the only language we shared. No sudden movements, no fear sounds, no stepping forward unless invited. He listened, then pointed to me, then to the woods, then pressed his palm to his chest as if making a promise he didn't need words to keep. When he came, he didn't come alone. Moss stepped out first, not into the open, but into the thin gray light between night and morning. He stood beside the creek and looked at me like he was checking whether I'd held up my end. Behind him, farther back among the trunks, I saw shapes, 3, maybe 4. A taller one with a heavy stance, older, broader, the kind that didn't need to show strength because it had always had it. A narrower one that stayed half hidden, and 2 smaller shadows close to her legs. Family, structure, not a lone animal wandering through a myth. Sheriff Callahan sucked in a breath so sharp I felt it in my own ribs. He didn't raise his hands, he didn't speak, he simply took his hat off slow, like he'd stepped into someone else's home. Dr. Monroe's eyes filled, but she didn't wipe them. She just stared with the kind of respect you don't learn in school. Moss moved 1 step closer and stopped. He didn't bare teeth, he didn't threaten. He lifted his hand, palm outward, then lowered it to his chest. I understood what he was offering before I understood why. He wasn't asking to be believed. He was saying, "We are here, and we are not your prey." I did what I always did when I didn't know the right thing. I followed the simplest thing. I put my hand to my own chest. "My name's Ben," I said, voice low. Moss touched his chest again and made a sound, soft, rough, not quite a word, but clear in its intention. "Moss," I repeated, the name settling between us like a plank laid across a ditch. The taller one in the trees stepped forward then, just enough for the gray light to catch his outline. He didn't come close, he didn't need to. He touched his own chest and made a deeper sound, longer, heavier. Moss looked back at him, then at me, like he was translating without a language. Then he pointed at the elder and made the sound again. I nodded. I didn't try to shape it perfectly. I just honored it by trying. Callahan's throat worked like he wanted to speak but didn't trust words. Finally he said, barely over the creek, "Jesus." Dr. Monroe breathed out and whispered, he's not a bear." "No," I said, "he's not." That was the meeting. That was the history. 3 humans standing in the damp dawn, and a people the world had turned into a joke, deciding for a few minutes not to be a joke anymore. The storm came after. Not weather, paper. Within a week, Callahan started getting calls he wouldn't explain over the phone. Dr. Monroe was asked strange questions at the clinic by men who didn't look sick. I found a white government-looking truck parked too long at the edge of a forest road, engine idling, driver pretending to study something on a clipboard. The truth spreads even when you carry it carefully. It doesn't need shouting. It just needs one wrong person to notice your silence. I didn't let it get that far. I went to the county office myself and asked for the one man there who still remembered what land was for. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. I said there was a family living in those woods that could not be treated like property.
I said if anyone went in with traps or guns, they'd be making a crime, not a discovery. It turned into meetings, quiet ones, the kind where people clear their throats and choose their words like they're picking nails out of a board. Callahan sat in on some, Dr. Monroe sat in on more. A state biologist came once, nervous, sweating, hands trembling around his notebook. He never got close enough to feel brave.
The agreement we built was small, but it was real. A protected zone marked on maps that weren't shared widely. No hunting, no traps, no drones. Limited access, monitored by Callahan's office under the excuse of wildlife restoration. It was a lie, technically, but it was a lie meant to stop worse lies. For a moment, it worked. Then the new threat showed up the way the worst ones do, without uniforms. It started with a single snare I found near the creek bend. Thin wire, too clean to be old, placed by someone who knew how animals move and didn't care what else might move there. 2 days later, another, and then tire tracks on my back road at midnight, deep, heavy, the kind of truck you don't drive unless you're hauling something you don't want seen. Moss came to me in the dark, not sneaking like before, but stepping into my yard as if it was already shared ground. His breathing was tight. He pointed toward the woods, then mimed a tightening motion with his hands. Trap. He mimed a cage with his fingers. I didn't need more. I didn't go looking for a fight. I went looking for an end. I walked the back roads at dawn and found their camp tucked where the ridge folds in on itself. 2 men, a cheap tent, a steel crate half covered with a tarp, a generator, and a stack of bait, apples, meat, honey. They were using our language against us. I didn't touch their guns. I didn't touch their food. I did the things I knew. I pulled the spark plug from their generator and dropped it in my pocket. I loosened the clamp on their fuel line so it would leak air and stall. I cut one strap on their crate so it would look tampered with. Then I walked away and let paranoia do the rest. That night the forest helped, not with violence, with presence. Heavy steps in the dark, branches broken high up where no man could reach, a chorus of low rolling sounds that made the air vibrate and made a human stomach remember it was not the biggest thing in the world. By morning the camp was half packed. By noon it was gone, only flattened grass and the smell of fear left behind. I should have felt proud. I didn't. I felt tired and relieved and ashamed of how close we'd come to losing everything over someone else's greed. A few evenings later, Moss led me to the creek bend again. The light was soft, the kind that makes the water look like it's carrying gold. There they were, more of them than I'd ever seen at once, standing back among the trees. Not a crowd, a gathering. Moss stepped forward and placed something on the flat stone by the water. Not shiny, not dramatic, a small worn object wrapped in cedar bark. I opened it with careful fingers. Inside was an old photograph, creased and faded. A younger man standing beside a pickup with a dog at his feet. The man was me, maybe 30 years younger, before grief settled into my shoulders, before my hair went gray. I stared at it until my vision blurred. They had been watching longer than I knew. I looked up, and Moss pressed his palm to his chest, then reached toward me, stopping short the way he always did, respecting the space. I understood then in a way that made my throat ache. I hadn't just found Moss. They had chosen me. Not because I was special, because I was steady, because I lived quiet,
because I knew what it meant to keep a promise without applause. I tucked the photograph inside my coat like it was a warm coal. We stood there a long time without speaking. The creek kept running, the woods kept breathing, and the world, for once, didn't get to take anything from us. I went home older than I'd been that morning, but lighter too. Not because the secret was gone, because trust, real trust, had finally become something we shared, not something I carried alone.